Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Since the Supreme Court decriminalized interracial marriages in 1967, the percentage of American married couples who are interracial or interethnic has increased dramatically. Currently, 1 in 10 American couples are interracial. Black-white couples in particular are heralded as a sign that crossing racial borders in dating and marriage is no longer taboo. But is this true? Erica Chito Childs is professor of sociology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She has studied the experiences of interracial couples and how communities respond to their relationships, and her findings shed light on the extent to which relations in this country have changed. Welcome.
Thank you.
So what has caused the rise in interracial dating and interracial marriage in this country?
Yeah, well, so I think it's interesting because we hear a lot about the rise in interracial marriage, and while the numbers have gone up, if you actually look at it overall, I would argue that it's still relatively low. So if you think, we have the civil rights movement, and we have all this talk about, obviously, the legalization of interracial marriage, but there's so much talk about how much things have gotten better. I think when you look at the marriage rates, if people married across racial boundaries with no thought to race, we would expect to have much higher rates.
I was surprised to learn that the most common type of interracial marriage is one between whites and Hispanic, a white person and a Hispanic person.
Yeah.
And that the least common type of interracial marriage is between whites and blacks.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's complicated when you talk about intermarriage is talking about all of the different groups and how to understand them, both from a perspective of race and ethnicity. So it's interesting when you're looking at whites and Latinos. One of the things that we're not sure is, depending on the Latino group involved, is that a interracial marriage? It's certainly interethnic, but color seems to be a very important boundary still in the United States. So skin color, for example, when you look at the statistics regarding Latino groups that tend to be lighter skinned have higher rates of intermarriage.
With whites?
With whites, yeah. So sometimes that data can skew intermarriage rates and make it look higher.
Okay. You've written that there are some interracial pairings that are considered more desirable and others are considered less desirable.
Yeah, so my work has really progressed into looking at this idea of racial hierarchies, and those are both across race and gender. So one of the interesting things that you see with interracial dating and marriage is that patterns are not the same within racial groups by gender. So for example, you see much higher rates of white men with Asian or Asian American women in the United States. And the lowest rates of intermarriage tend to be for black women. So even black men have higher rates of intermarriage. And I think that this is really important to think about because it ties into so many of these racial and gendered stereotypes that have existed in this country, since the earliest days. So I think that that's one thing that I think that's really important to think about in terms of looking at intermarriage and trying to understand who intermarries and why. And then also, in terms of this hierarchy, there's a number of factors. Obviously, it's not all race, but skin color, socioeconomic status, as well as gender seem to play a role, as well as the history of race relations. So I think in a place like the United States, the black-white divide is still the strongest.
Another interesting finding, that white females tend to approve of interracial marriage more than other groups.
At least, so if you do survey attitudes, oftentimes white women will express approval of interracial dating and marriage. So in terms of their behavior, sometimes it can be different.
Okay.
So you can't always believe. I'm a qualitative researcher, and one of the reasons is that when you look at quantitative surveys, people sometimes can just check off, yes, I approve. But I think it's very different when you speak to people and ask them,
what
you
do
may
they
approve,
do?
But what do you do? What do you do? And tell me, who is your last partner and who have you married? So I think that is, there's a difference there.
It's not surprising, the finding that Democrats and Democratic leading independents are more likely to say that interracial marriage is a good thing, more so than Republicans and Republican-leaning independents. Do black females tend to have the most negative opinion of interracial relationships?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I've done a lot of research on this because I think that oftentimes Black women get labeled as angry about interracial dating and marriage. And I think it's kind of an unfair characterization. So from films that we see where you have women who are angry about their partner leaving them for a white woman, a lot of movies feature that. So what I argue is that Black women are disadvantaged oftentimes in the dating pool. So what happens is that there's oftentimes a lack of African American men available. And then at the same time, white men and men of other races are less likely to choose African American women as dating partners or preference. There's been some recent studies that came out looking at online dating, which kind of come and show this also, that Black women are the least likely to be chosen. So I think it's really important to think about that context of the available pool. And then in my own research and interviews with Black women that I've spoken to, Black women talk about that it's not that they're opposed to interracial dating, it's that one, they feel that they're often devalued in this society where the standards of beauty are not how they look, at least not naturally. So that's one piece. And then secondly, they often don't say that men of other races do not approach them. And then the third piece of it is that oftentimes the African American men who are available, if they're choosing to date interracially, then it leaves them in even a more precarious position.
So if Black men are dating, looking at white women, and white men and Asian men are not looking at you, then you're sort of left in the lurch. Who is there for you in terms of dating?
Yeah, so I think that the blame is placed on Black women, where really we should be looking more at the society and the standards and the way that women are judged and the opportunities available.
You write that in order to gauge communities' true feelings about race, you have to look not at the number of interracial couples, but at the attitudes that different communities have towards interracial couples.
Yeah, I think this is really important. As a young scholar, I was always reading studies on interracial marriage, and there's plenty of them. But they tended to look at couples and tried to figure out, why did they come together? What was it that motivated them? Was it psychological? Was it demographic factors? And what I always found fascinating about interracial dating and marriage was not the couple, but the attitudes of the communities they came from. So for example, why do we call it, if we don't care, why do we call it an interracial couple? We often label it that because we see it as different. It's not what we consider the norm, even still today. So I think it's really important, as I referenced earlier in talking about surveys, to actually speak to families and communities about their attitudes, because so much more comes out when you sit down with a group and say, oh, how do you feel about interracial dating? How do you feel about interracial marriage? Both for yourself and your family, but also within your community and your experience with it in the community.
And you found that mixing across established boundaries of race, ethnicity, or religion, or tribe is still dangerous.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Some people laugh and say, dangerous, really? And actually it can be dangerous though, in terms of that in this country, it's not uncommon for an interracial couple. There's been stories in the past few weeks I've seen where a white woman and a Black man go into a bar and they were targeted by some white men because of the interracial relationship. So interracial couples still are targeted because of their relationship. But I think more importantly, what I say when I mean dangerous is that it can have very real consequences. So families can disown their family member. They can censor them in other ways.
It's dangerous in terms of your relationship with your own community.
Yeah. So there's many levels to it. Yeah, it could be with the relationship with your own family, with your community, as well as larger implications, certainly in the U.S., but even globally.
You found that there's a difference in whites' attitude toward interracial marriage and Blacks' attitudes towards interracial marriage in terms of what they will tell you and what their behavior is. Explain that. Yeah,
so as a researcher going into white communities, the assumption was almost that was going to be much easier for me to get information, being that I myself am a white woman. So in these interviews, though, oftentimes, and not to stereotype all whites, the white communities that I spoke to tended not to want to really talk about interracial dating. So when I'd bring up the topic, oftentimes they'd say things like, oh, haven't thought about that. Or then when pressed would say, oh, I think it's great. If you like it, I love it. And as a researcher, what we notice is these kind of ways that motioning that this is something that happens outside of their community and their family. And ultimately what was said is that there was support expressed theoretically for interracial dating and marriage, but then specifically said, well, I personally wouldn't do it because either that's not my preference, I'm not attracted, I have nothing in common.
And I wouldn't want my children to.
And I wouldn't want my children to. And so in reasons where marriage is hard enough, I wouldn't want them to experience racism. So what I call it, this idea of this supportive opposition. So while saying they're supportive, they actually don't want it to happen for themselves, their family, and they don't know many interracial couples in their community. Interestingly, in African American communities across the United States, you bring up the topic of interracial marriage, and most participants have a lot to say. It's a very engaging topic. So the first kind of comments are, I have a lot of problems with interracial relationships, and I'm going to tell you why. It can rep anything from being symbolic of being a sellout to having effects, and if we've experienced racism, why would anybody engage in this? So there's this kind of theoretical or general opposition to interracial marriage. Yet then when you start talking, have you ever dated interracially? Oftentimes, yes. Anyone in your family? Absolutely, yes. So African Americans talk about how, yes, my aunt is married to a white man and they've got kids. I love them. So what at first comes off as opposition, I call oppositional support, because in reality, the communities have always been supportive of interracial couples and absorbed them, and especially the children of interracial unions, into the communities. So what initially seems like one is supportive and one is oppositional is the exact opposite.
We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with Erica Chito Childs, Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Erica Chito Childs, Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. You suggest that at the root of this often hidden white skepticism about interracial relationships is the stereotype that blacks are inferior.
Yeah.
That remains.
Yeah, so my research operates from a critical race perspective and really understands that racism is still alive, unfortunately alive and well in the United States. And I think one of the ways that you can see it the most is when you ask people about their romantic preferences. So where in many ways, people may not want to say that they won't work with someone of another race, or that they don't want someone to move into their neighborhood of another race.
Or they don't want the children to go to school with someone.
Yeah, so they realize that they maybe aren't going to say that. But what they will tell you is who they will date, who they will marry, and who they want their children to date and marry. And within these comments, they are saying that an entire race of people are unmarriable. And within that then is all of these stereotypes, negative stereotypes, because what makes an entire race, an entire group unmarriable? You must have certain assumptions and stereotypes about that entire group to be able to say, I could never marry someone from this group, knowing that you haven't met many, if any from that group.
What factors are at the root of black skepticism about interracial relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. I often get that saying, well, everyone is opposed. Everybody wants their family members ideally to marry within their own group. But I think that it's very important to look at the root of it. When I speak to black families and communities about opposition, it's always rooted in the belief in white racism. So if they don't want their child to marry interracially, it comes out of a fear of what will happen to their child. Will their child, even if it's an adult, will they experience racism from their intimate partner? So they talk about the possibility of racial slurs, of being mistreated, and what would happen in the larger society. So it doesn't come out of a belief in the inferiority of whites. It's about protecting the family and really referencing the history in the United States of race relations between whites and blacks as a reason, as well as contemporary realities.
So there's this mistrust of the white partners and certainly of their families, but also the feeling that blacks who date outside their race are rejecting their blackness. They're taking their gifts and giving it to somebody else instead of keeping it in the race.
Yeah, it's a really sensitive topic because I think, as I was talking earlier, particularly for Black women who already feel devalued within the larger white society, and then to have men from their own community seemingly buying into that devaluation. So I think there's oftentimes a belief that if you're African American and you date interracially, that you're choosing white, especially for Black men. And the idea is that if successful Black men date or marry interracially, they oftentimes then are taking their success with them outside of the Black community. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily true, but I think that there's a lot of that sentiment certainly exists. And I think that it's also because when you look at intermarriage rates, they're very low for Blacks and whites, but they're tend to be between Black men and white women if it's going to happen at all.
Do we know why there's this disparity in far more Black men choosing white women and very few Black women with white men?
Yeah. I think there's a number of factors. So when you're thinking about heterosexual relationships, men still oftentimes have a lot more power in terms of choosing partners. So I think that could be part of it. We talked about earlier how white men are less likely to choose Black women as their partner or pursue them as a romantic interest. So I think that's one piece of it. And then if you really look at kind of the ways that both Black men and Black women are represented in the media and in popular culture, Black men tend to be represented as oftentimes criminal and dangerous. Yeah, on the flip side, they're also oftentimes put forth as sex symbols, as they're the best athlete, and that we could really trace back to even the history of slavery, where Black men were feared, but they were also they were feared because they were seen as being stronger.
Right.
And there's all sorts of sexual stereotypes that have always accompanied that about Black prowess. And so when we fast forward to today, those stereotypes and those images have changed, but only slightly. They keep the historical roots. And I think for Black women, the same thing with stereotypes, that oftentimes Black women during slavery, while they were being raped by slave masters, at the same time were not being appreciated as the epitome of femininity. And so if we look today, I think you see those same remnants of those stereotypes.
Did you hear from Black women that they felt white men were just not interested in them?
Certainly when I began my research. I think that in the last few years, there has been some change in that. So there's been some trends and certainly on social media with more Black women talking about opening up the possibility of dating and looking at the options. And so I think that there's a slight change. I don't know if we see it in terms of the rates of marriage yet, but I think that there's a turn happening. And I've seen that within my own research, where if I go back 15 years and was talking to groups of Black women, there was less acknowledgement within the group about the desire to date interracial or even the possibility. Whereas I think that in what I've noticed in more recent focus groups, that more Black women are saying, I'm thinking about it. I'm open to the possibility. I have a friend who was online and met someone, or I have a friend who follows this website that talks about, swirling in terms of dating. So,
you interviewed a lot of college students.
Yeah.
Do their views of interracial dating and marriage differ considerably from those of older members of their groups?
Interestingly, not so much. So when I do the interviews, I do racially homogenous groups. So it would be all individuals who identify as white, all individuals who identify as Black. And what's interesting about it is college students oftentimes will express that they might be open to dating on college campus. They're still pretty clear usually about marriage, and that they anticipate and expect to marry within their own race. And they also oftentimes talk about how their parents and family also expect them to marry within their own race.
What did you learn from Black women who are married to white partners? There was a group of them that you interviewed.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I find that in looking at interracial couples, there's no one type, right, in terms of the way they're thinking. But what was interesting in that partners that involved Black women and white men, the Black partner, the woman, tended to be very still racially conscious, meaning that some couples I talked to, particularly Black men married to white women, would say things like, I don't want to be constrained to a race. Love is colorblind. You know, I'm not black, she's not white. We're just in love. So you tended to hear that among some of the couples that involve black men and white women. But the couples that involved black women and white men were actually tended to be different, and you didn't see that much. The black woman almost said, no, I'm a black woman, he's a white man. We never forget that. Yet when we're in the household together, I don't say, John, you white guy, you left your socks out. It's like, John's my husband and he's dirty. He's leaving a mess around the house. So what the difference was, what they were saying is, like, obviously race matters. Like, we don't forget that we occupy different racial groups in this country, but it's not part of our intimate relationship. But that was a difference. So I thought that there was something about oftentimes black women who would marry outside their race were still very much aware and in terms of their black identity and how important that was to them.
You looked at how the popular media treats interracial relationships. What did you find?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that I think every year there seems to be more interracial couples that we see in television and in film. But what happens is that they still follow a particular pattern. It's less likely you see a happily married interracial couple with their own biological kids. It's becoming more common, but for example, if they're going to have an interracial couple, then they have children from their previous marriage, or you'll have a couple that adopts children of another race. So oftentimes, the family is still being portrayed outside the norm. There's also certain patterns that happen in terms of when white women are paired opposite black men in film, oftentimes the relationship is either destructive or it's part of a downward spiral. On the flip side, when you see white men paired opposite women of color, it tends to follow this pattern where the white man is saving the woman, the group, the community. There's some scholars who've talked about even this phenomenon as like the white savior. So you have films where you have a white person come in and is saving the day, and oftentimes that white man will also engage in a relationship with a woman of color from that community.
Interesting. Did anything you learned in the course of your research surprise you?
What surprised me the most about my research is the reception to it. So oftentimes when I was doing the research and I would present on it, people would say, I don't believe you. I think that people are very accepting of interracial relationships now. Look, you live in New York City and you see interracial relationships all the time. So I was always really surprised how much opposition there was to looking critically at these issues. The other thing that would surprise me sometimes is how in responding to my research or reading the book, people became very defensive because they were like, well, I've said some of those things before, and I wouldn't date interracially, but I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced. And so to me, what was most interesting about the research was the response to it and how it made people defensive, and I think further exposed how difficult it is for people to want to talk about race and intimacy in very open and honest ways.
Yeah. I've never met anybody who admitted to having racist feelings or to having any friends or relatives who had any racist feelings.
Yeah.
Are there some main conclusions that you have drawn from your research?
Yeah, I think to me, one of the things that I think is the most important is to think about that dating and marriage is so much more than personal preference. And I think that it's important for us to look at it through a critical lens and understand that the decisions that people are making and the discourses that we accept, right, in terms of saying, you know, I'm open, I'm not racist, but I wouldn't date this group. I think we have to start to think more critically about that. Language is important. Attraction and preference is always much more than just about relationships. As some of what I was saying about the interviews with Black women, it has significant consequences if you are part of a group that you feel is devalued, whether it's in education or in the marriage market.
So I think your research is another indication of how far we've come, but we've got a ways to go.
Yeah, definitely.
In this whole area.
And I think it's just really important that people are able to have these conversations. And I hope that's what I try to do with my research, present it in very accessible ways and try to open up these conversations about things like dating and marriage and have people think about race and gender through that.
Why did you decide to pursue this area of research?
Yeah, so I became interested as an undergraduate, and I myself was involved in an interracial relationship, and my children are biracial. And so I think that was the initial interest, just because I saw how differently people responded to me, because I was dating and then married to an African American man. And so as an 18, 19-year-old in college, I was like, I'm going to study this. And then I actually went on and got a PhD and do study that now, moved far beyond caring about it personally. But I think that it's really intriguing. And as a sociologist, I think we're always interested in getting to the core of people's feelings and views. And to me, when you ask about these very personal issues of race, of sexuality, of gender and relationships, rather than it make people be quiet, I think that it's an opportunity to really get to the core of what they're thinking.
We're out of time. I'd like to thank Erica Chito Childs, Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center, for joining me today. For One to One and the City University of New York, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.